After 12 years of being a rock climbing enthusiast, Austin Howell fell from a height of 24 meters. The medics tried to resuscitate him, but it looked like Howell had died instantly and didn't even have time to feel anything. That's why this death only got 5 points on the pain scale, while the maximum of 140 points goes to the feeling of being skinned alive. However, the most incredible thing is that Howell experienced the entire scale during his other rock climbing ventures. After this, anyone would have given up that dangerous hobby. In this video, I'll tell you about the worst ways to die on a hike. Viewer discretion is advised. On December 23, 2017, Tomek Mickiewicz, a Polish mountaineer, was standing at the foot of Nanga Parbat for the 7th time. The first 6 attempts he'd made with his buddy, Marek Klinowski, had failed. Most likely, the reason was that Mickiewicz wanted to summit the 8,000er in the winter, something no one had managed to do at the time. In the cold season, the temperature there drops to minus 45 degrees Celsius, and the wind gusts get as fast as 160 kilometers per hour. So Klinowski refused to keep risking his life, and Mickiewicz joined forces with the legendary mountaineer, Elizabeth Revel. They started their ascent on January 21, 2018. However, the pair had to wait out a terrible storm in the 2nd and 3rd camps. 4 days passed before the mountaineers finally managed to reach the last part of the ascent, where they faced a tough choice. They could either turn back and stop for the night below the death zone, or take a risk by continuing on their path and most likely getting stuck at night. The death zone, above 8,000 meters, has so little oxygen that the human body keeps on dying cell by cell, unable to regenerate. Yet Tomek didn't want to lose his 7th chance at fulfilling his life's dream. So he and his partner decided to walk on. Very soon, the happy Elizabeth was standing on the summit of Nanga Parbat, becoming the first woman to conquer the mountain in the winter. But Tomek couldn't see anything at that point anymore, as his eyes were literally filled with ice crystals. The climber had gone blind from acute mountain sickness. He was becoming increasingly slow and drowsy. His nose went white with hypothermia, and his every inhale was accompanied by a terrifying wheeze. Everything pointed to Tomek having developed lung and brain swelling in the course of his mountain sickness. Elizabeth managed to transport her partner to a point below 7,315 meters, build a shelter, and call for help. However, a group of mountaineers could only set out to look for them the following day. The rescuers had to ascend almost from base camp, moving at an incredibly dangerous speed and, most importantly, with no destination. They didn't know Elizabeth and Tomek's coordinates. After 6 hours in the dark, they first heard a woman's voice, and then they saw Elizabeth, absolutely exhausted and barely conscious. She was all alone. Getting her to a rescue helicopter took 18 hours. She had severe frostbite on her arms, but recovered. Regarding Tomek Mickiewicz, the rescuers didn't even attempt to look for him. It was simply impossible in those conditions. Death from mountain sickness is estimated to be 30 points at the lower end of the pain scale. So, is climbing lower mountains in a warm climate safer? In the summer of 1996, a German couple consisting of Egbert Rimkus and Cornelia Meyer, with their 2 children, came to see Death Valley in California. They rented a minivan, brought a tourist guide, and stocked up on cool drinks. Yet, the air outside their conditioned car windows reached almost 55 degrees Celsius. A higher temperature had only been recorded once before. Anyway, the tourist family was having fun until they went to Mengol Pass. Their minivan literally fell apart on the mountain roads. So the couple and their 2 children got stranded in a remote corner of one of the world's hottest places. They sought shelter in the shade of the broken minivan, soaked in perspiration, with no idea how to save their lives. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Rimkus and Meyer took the kids along with their meager provision and started descending from the mountains. However, the unrelenting heat resumed with daybreak. Then the tourists started feeling faint and dizzy. They went on to suffer from seizures, and their internal organs gave out one by one, until the entire family died of heat stroke and dehydration. On the pain scale, this death stands at 70 points. Still, even deadly heat can't compare with losing your life to the cold. On the slopes of Everest alone, over 200 people have turned into ice. But the deadliest event in the history of mountaineering happened in Japan in 1902. On that day, 210 soldiers of the 5th Company set out for military exercises, but got lost in a blizzard just a few days later. The men dug holes in the snow to hide from the foul weather, but ended up in puddles of melted snow, and started getting frostbite on their feet. They were ordered to cut some wood for the whole flooring, but since it was inconvenient to do it in gloves, the soldiers took them off and got frostbite on their hands. So, in the morning, when the 5th Company continued on their way, every step brought the men unbearable suffering. Moreover, they were left without food since all their provisions got completely frozen. The last fateful mistake of the commanders was the order to climb a hill to navigate the terrain. There, the soldiers were attacked by an ice-cold wind, from which they couldn't hide and had no energy to dig another shelter. The men stood in concentric circles, putting the weakest soldiers in the center. By the evening, a third of them had already frozen to death. In the few days that followed, this fate was shared by 199 soldiers of the 5th Company. The bodies of those who were found alive were frozen to such an extent that it was impossible to penetrate their skin with a needle. Only 11 people were saved, and almost all of them lost their limbs. I think they'd agree with me saying that a slow death from the cold has rightfully received its 78 points on the pain scale. However, Austin Howell, the rock climber I mentioned at the beginning, didn't even have to freeze in the mountains to surpass this result. He fell during his usual training on a climbing wall, breaking 3 vertebrae and both legs. On the pain scale, these injuries take 81 points. Still, Howell didn't abandon his passion. Furthermore, after rehabilitation, he started climbing with no safety gear. However, we'll come back to Howell's suffering later. And now, let's return to the climbers stuck high in the mountains. But there, they risk dying not just because of the cold or the lack of air. On June 19, 2012, 5 climbers set out to the summit of Mount Rainier, a 4,000er in the state of Washington. They started their ascent successfully, but Claire Coltgen suddenly got weak and returned to the camp. So only 4 people summited the mountain, and now they were in for a descent that was just as dangerous. Ross Van Dyke led the group downward after the members tied themselves together with a single rope. Suddenly, the last person in the rope team, Stacy Wren, lost equilibrium and tumbled off the slope, taking the rest of the group with her. This kind of fall is virtually impossible to survive. Gradually, the darkness dissipated, and Van Dyke regained consciousness. The first sensation he had, though, was unbearable pain in the hip, which he'd broken. Wren came round too and woke up to the unconscious team leader, Stuart Smith. They all noticed 3 important things. Firstly, the entire team was tied together with a single rope. Secondly, something had stopped their fall. Thirdly, the 4th group member, Noelle Smith, was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, she was dangling over the bottomless ice crevice, entangled in the ropes, serving as an anchor to her teammates. All of them finally reached Noelle and realized the gravity of the situation. They couldn't get the girl out of the hole, not just because she was holding everyone on the slope, but also because she was severely injured. Apart from other trauma, Noelle Smith had a fractured skull and her spine was broken in several places. Van Dyke was lucky enough to get mobile phone coverage and call for help. Yet a rescue squad would take hours to reach the injured mountaineers, who were bleeding and freezing. When a helicopter finally appeared on the horizon, the climbers thought their trials were over. But they were wrong. Noelle was the first one to be taken up on board since her trauma was the most serious. When the stretcher was lowered again to evacuate the second victim, Nick Hall, a park ranger, slipped and fell from a rock. In addition, the helicopter ran out of fuel and had to return to the base with only Noelle on board. Even though all mountaineers were rescued in the end, there were still victims. On the pain scale, numerous fractures like Noelle's are assessed as 85 points or more. Yet the climber was evacuated on time. That's why she survived. It might look like we've covered all the ways to die in the mountains, but in reality, there's one more left. September 2012 marked the beginning of the climbing season for the Himalayan 8,000er, Mount Manaslu. The weather wasn't the best though. It was snowing heavily on the summit, and the winds were stronger than usual. Because of this, Camp 3 even had to be transported to another location, since that season's cold wind pummeled its usual location. When a window of fair weather finally appeared, dozens of mountaineers started their ascent. The moment some of them reached Camp 3, though, the mountain got hit by a powerful blizzard. The climbers waited out the bad weather in their tents and went to sleep when it didn't cease by nightfall. Gregory Costa was also resting at Camp 3. His partner, Glenn Plake, was reading since he couldn't sleep, even though it was already around 5 a.m. The next second, Plake saw an invisible force throw Costa out into the darkness, wrap Glenn in the torn tent, and toss him into the snow. A few seconds later, a sudden wind gust carried away all the tents with mountaineers inside them at Camp 2. The climbers came to their senses pretty fast and started picking their stuff up when they noticed the lights at the upper camp. At first, they thought the mountaineers there were packing up to resume their ascent, but they quickly realized Camp 3 didn't exist anymore. That morning, a giant ice clump fell off from the rocks, causing a mighty avalanche that buried 31 people in the snow. Although some mountaineers from Camp 2 lost even their shoes, they rushed to help immediately. What they saw, though, was a mass snow grave. All those who'd made it out of the snow and could walk were helping to look for and rescue others. Yet 11 mountaineers were buried alive under meters of snow that kept setting and increasingly weighing down on their chests, obstructing their breathing. Gregory Costa was one of them. When the adrenaline level in his blood dropped a bit, the man started panicking, awaiting his demise and suffering from the incredible cold and pain in his entire body. That's why on the pain scale, getting buried alive in an avalanche stands at 90 points. Although it's not quite clear how to assess emotional suffering, even more so given the fact that you can't get rid of it with painkillers. The climber named Austin Howell realized this very well after his second fall. I'm going back to his story again because during an attempt at scaling an almost kilometer-tall rock called El Capitan in Yosemite, he fell for the second time, hitting his head. The doctors kept him in an artificial coma for 10 days. When Howell regained consciousness, he felt unbearable pain due to the fractures of the wrist, the shoulder blade, the spine in 5 places, and the skull. Although he was being given painkillers, all these injuries combined got around 98 points on the pain scale. Apart from that, Howell had an eardrum rupture. This caused him to lose not only his hearing in one ear, but also his sense of equilibrium. Howell became clumsy, even when walking. However, he wasn't going to abandon climbing. Surprisingly, Howell felt much more confident in the mountains. One time, fans recognized him at a pizza place. But having seen Austin trip on his own feet and spill coffee on himself, the fans started doubting that the man was a famous rock climber. However, mountains remained the only thing that interested Howell, and he continued doing solo climbs for a few more years until that fateful fall. His death was almost painless, though. The same thing can't be said about Amy Adamson, who was killed by a bear. The former teacher was on a hike in the western part of Yellowstone. Earlier, she had backpacked the entire country and written a book about it. Amy was a seasoned tourist, but couldn't do anything against a wrathful female bear that attacked her in the park and mauled her to death. Later, the animal was found and neutralized. But this didn't change the fact that Adamson had died of what got 100 points on the pain scale. So, what needs to happen during a hike for a person to live through the maximum of 140 points? Sadly, Stephen Otter Olshansky knew the answer to this question all too well. He was a veteran of all-country hikes through the Continental Divide Trail. That is, he had conquered almost 5,000 kilometers of this trail multiple times. In 2015, Olshansky hadn't planned to hike any trails. However, he visited a friend in November and asked for a tourist stove. For some reason, he changed his plans even though it was too late, as winter was coming. Yet Olshansky did some rigorous planning for his hike on a well-known route. On November 14th, Olshansky's friend dropped him off at the Cumbres Pass and expected Stephen to call him from Ghost Ranch. However, from the very start, nothing went to plan. On the first day of the hike, Stephen felt terrible fatigue. He must have contracted the flu. Yet the man walked on, only to regret it 3 days later, which he shared in his vlog.
I'm in big trouble.
Suddenly, over 30 centimeters of snow fell overnight, and the temperature dropped drastically. Although Olshansky had a stove, it turned out he had no warm clothes and footwear, satellite connection, or even a map. The hiker used his phone exclusively to record videos until the battery died. Olshansky tried to get out of the trap, but there was so much snow that it was impossible to walk. So he returned to a place he'd already passed and was terrified to realize that he'd gotten frostbite on his feet. Yet the weather continued raging for another week, and Stephen Olshansky's condition was worsening. In 17 days, he made one of the most difficult decisions of his life: to take matters into his own hands instead of waiting for help. Stephen remembered there was an old campsite with a small toilet nearby where he could hide from the storm. He relied on his memory to find the direction and just started walking through the blizzard. When Olshansky, totally exhausted, finally fell into the snow, in the corner of his eye, he saw the toilet he'd been walking toward. The man managed to warm himself in a sleeping bag, then lit up the stove and boiled some water. Stephen found a bag of horse oats in the neighboring shed so he could even eat. It seemed like things were starting to look up, but they weren't. Even though a search for Olshansky had started as soon as he didn't call his friend when he'd said he would, the blizzard was impeding the effort. Every day in every diary entry, Stephen was slowly losing his strength. He tried to get out once again, but got an even worse frostbite. When his time in the trap started being counted in weeks, the desperate Olshansky dared to try and end his suffering by lighting up his stove in the bathroom. The attempt failed, though. One day, Stephen felt so weak that he had no energy to light up the stove and melt some snow. Then, the man realized that was how he would meet his end. The last entries in Stephen Olshansky's diary are dated as February 2016. That is at least 80 days after he'd gone missing. During that whole time, he was documenting the unspeakable suffering he went through at the hands of the constant cold, hunger, dehydration, and awaiting his imminent death. Stephen even left a handwritten note on the bathroom door saying that his body was in there. So, all factors considered, Stephen Olshansky's horrific experience got a maximum of 140 points. You can watch a more detailed story about Stephen's tribulations and other cases mentioned in this video on my channel. Take good care of yourselves to make sure your knowledge of the pain scale stays exclusively here instead of in the real world.